God knew that fallen man would need to work and stay busy, and that this would form a protective shield against temptation and sin. But see, he also knew that we needed the Sabbath. The Sabbath is for our mental health. We need that rest. You know, for many of us who either grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church or spent considerable time as Adventists, Sabbath observance has always been a huge part of our Christian experience. Is that right? I mean, for me, a lifetime of Sabbath observance. Now, there may be some of you out there, maybe some that are listening, who are new, relative Adventism, and maybe just beginning to experience that distinctive and singular blessing which is the Sabbath. Now, admittedly, the Sabbath has become an important and also an identifying feature of the SDA Church. Well, the same is true for each one of us. Each one of us who belong to the Everlasting Way Advent Fellowship, since we are making the claim of being historic Adventists. Okay? But having stipulated to all of that, we should also fully understand that the Sabbath is so much more than a denominational identifier, which it kind of feels like it is sometimes. And so this morning, in spite of the fact that we've heard more than our share of sermons and teachings on the Sabbath, we are going to take what I hope and pray will be a fresh and spirit-enlightened look at the seventh-day Sabbath. I hope this will maybe give you a different view of the Sabbath than the one that you've had all your life. Or maybe for those of you that really haven't looked at the Sabbath, it will give you a new and exciting appreciation of this day, which is a weekly memorial. You know, nothing in the biblical record, nor in the inspired writings of Ellen White, would indicate just how many Sabbaths Adam and Eve were able to enjoy in their Garden of Eden home. Am I right? So we don't know how many Sabbaths they had. I mean, we can speculate that it may have been several, it may have been many. But I have to tell you that I tend to think, and I say this sadly, I tend to think that it probably wasn't all that many. And I admit that I'm making this assumption based on what I know and what I've learned about the power of sin. To be more specific, how easily, how quickly we all just seem to fall prey to its deceptive allure. It doesn't seem to take very much time at all. And if you're like me, and that reality makes you feel bad and maybe even feel way overmatched in this ongoing battle against evil, well, you might find some solace in the fact that 1/3 of the heavenly host of angels, 1/3, think about this, 1/3 of these perfect beings who had no trace or history of prior sin and no inherited proclivity to sin, they fell to that sin. They fell to those insinuations coming from Lucifer. But I want you to mostly take heart in the fact that this is exactly why only the Son of God could come and rescue us from the terrible tentacles of sin. Sin is so virulent that there could only be one way to save us from its power, Jesus. So having said all that, I admit that it's possible that Satan, getting back to that thought, that he probably had to play the long game, maybe, with our first parents. Maybe he had to wait for them to become complacent, to become overconfident, and gradually to become off guard a little bit. But you know what? I doubt it. I doubt if it went on very long. But regardless of just how many Sabbaths they were able to enjoy in the Garden of Eden, I believe that we can learn a great deal in trying to imagine what those sin-free Sabbaths, those first Sabbaths, would have been like. So for starters, there was certainly never any confusion back there in the garden as to which day was the correct day, right? Were they confused on that? No, they were not. Adam and Eve never ever thought to question whether the seventh day was really the Sabbath. Nor did they wonder if it might be just a loose suggestion rather than a firm directive. Did they ponder that? No, I don't think so. So consequently, they never thought to rationalize that the first or the second day would be a fine alternative. Can you imagine Adam and Eve going, well, why don't we just keep Sabbath on Sunday or on Monday? No, that didn't happen. Instead, it isn't hard to imagine that very much like earthly parents telling their growing child about the day that they were born, God lovingly explained to this perfect pair how they and the world around them came to exist. Don't you imagine that? That would have been an interesting conversation. Let me tell you how you came about, What a story, right?
I think Jesus walked him through it.
You walk them through it.
And explained.
I think so too.
The process.
I think so too. I love that. And just like when a parent does that, that little kid just trying to grasp it all, But Adam and Eve knew all about the days of creation. They knew that the birds and the fishes, they were on day 5. They knew that all the rest of the animals and they themselves were day number 6. And they knew without a shadow of a doubt that the Sabbath was day number 7. They knew that. In addition, they never had to waste even a single thought or spend one tiny second wondering if, and because of the relentless passage of time, whether the days had somehow gotten jumbled up and mixed up. They never had to think that, did they? Oh, and they also didn't have to deal with the inconvenience factor. Think about this. Or the familial peer pressure of worshiping on a different day than all the rest of their friends and family. Did they have that as an issue? No. I'm also virtually 100% certain that when the essence of the Sabbath was explained to them and how it was a very special day unto the Lord and that they would be spending each Sabbath being particularly close to their Creator, that the prospects of this did not fill them with a deep sense of dread. Do you think it did? No. They didn't dread that at all. Oh, great! A special day for us to be with you.
They were excited because Jesus was coming.
They were excited. That's something we should really understand about the Sabbath. They were excited about it. Nor do I believe that however many Sabbaths they were in fact able to enjoy in the garden, any of those Sabbaths ever became for them an exercise of loathsome boredom and drudgery. I mean, I hate to admit this to you, but as a young Seventh-day Adventist kid growing up, there's a lot of Sabbaths that I just couldn't wait, for it to be over, right? I don't believe that Adam and Eve ever found themselves doing what I just did. Clock watching during the hours of the Sabbath, silently just checking off the hours and wishing that they would pass more quickly. I'm going to read an excerpt from The Desire of Ages. She writes, "The Sabbath was hallowed at the creation. As ordained for man, it had its origin when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Job 38:7. She continues, "Peace brooded over the world, for earth was in harmony with heaven. Because he had rested upon the Sabbath, God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. He set it apart to a holy use. He gave it to Adam as a day of rest. It was a memorial of the work of creation and thus a sign of God's power and his love." So, this brings us, unfortunately, to a very, very, very sad question. But it's a question that must be asked. What happened to the Sabbath? What happened to it? Other than Jesus Christ himself, has anything been more specifically attacked throughout the centuries than this one day? Reflecting on prophetic insight, will anything represent a greater line of demarcation between true commandment-keeping believers and deceived believers in these, the last days? No. It really does not unreasonably stretch the imagination to visualize Satan painting this humongous target, if you will, on the seventh day of the week. Can't you just sort of see him doing that? As that is precisely how much he has intentionally attacked this one day, and how much he passionately hates this one day. Why? Well, in case you have not figured this one out yet, Satan hates what God loves. Satan hates what God loves. Satan hates that God and only God is creator. And Satan hates anything that memorializes God's creative work. Satan hates anything that is a representation of or a reflection of God and his perfect holy character. And Satan hates anything and everything that God has specifically and lovingly established. And so doesn't it logically follow then that since God established and blessed marriage, Satan's attacks on that sacred institution have been relentless? Doesn't it follow? You can almost go down the list of things that God has established that Satan hates. And so we see in that one example that divorce rates, they continue to skyrocket, while the divine parameters and boundaries of this holy union are being obliterated beyond all recognition. God created a world of absolute perfection. It was an amazing display of his artistry, of his creative power, of his imagination. But look around you now. You can't help but observe how the enemy has profaned this perfect work of creation, and how all of nature has been reduced to little more than a desperate struggle to survive while being sadly conditioned to violence and death. Do you ever think about that? I do when I see roadkill, like I do just about every single time I drive down here. It makes me realize that this beautiful act of nature, all these amazing creatures, it has all been reduced to just a struggle to survive on this planet. What about the holy law? What about the holy law of God? The holy law, which is a mirror-like reproduction of who God is. It has been explained away as non-essential, methodically whittled and pared down to virtual non-existence. And the Sabbath? Well, not only has the Sabbath day itself been attacked, but also how to keep it. Sabbath observance has become riddled with a painful list of do's and don'ts. And as a result of these subtle attacks, well, the pendulum seems to swing wildly between maniacally strict observance and painfully lax observance. Satan controls this world. It is for the moment his kingdom. And so he relentlessly throws the world's attractions and distractions at would-be and should-be Sabbath keepers, doesn't he? Constantly. God's special holy day is forced to compete with sporting events. It's forced to compete with huge shopping sales, to-do lists, vacation plans, trips to the amusement park, movie premieres, and social gatherings of all kinds. Adam and Eve, they had none of these distractions. They had none of these temptations back in the garden. No shopping, no TVs, no football, no iPhones, no barbecues. And you know what? When we are at last free to enjoy that first Sabbath in heaven and in the world made new, we won't have any of those things either. And you know what? We won't miss them one bit. We won't miss them one bit. Well, you know, this sermon, oh, by the way, is not just about the very first Sabbath in the garden. It's also about that very first Sabbath that we will experience without sin. There is a Sabbath rest coming. Sabbath for the world that so often chose to decline that rest experience. Reading from Hebrews 4, there remains therefore a rest for the people of God. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works, as God did from his. I've always pondered the words of Jesus, the words that you read earlier, Mark, and they are found in Mark 2, verse 27 and 28. And he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." And so I have to confess something. As I was writing this sermon, I was once again considering this text, and the thought came to me that perhaps I've been looking for the obscure in these words instead of focusing on the obvious and the literal. So literally then, Jesus could very well have been saying, we created the Sabbath specifically for man and not the other way around. Now you can clearly see this in the very order that we chose to follow when we created. Can you hear Jesus saying this? Going on, he says, chronologically, the Sabbath was created after we created man, because it was created for man. Actually, every part of creation was for the enjoyment and the betterment of man and woman. The sun, moon, stars, water, all other creatures. And on the last day of our creative work, we made for our children a sanctuary of time, the Sabbath. So, do you mind if we expand a little bit on this morning? It's going to involve a little speculative detour. Some of you might call it a bunny trail. See, to my knowledge, I'm going to go on this trail as if you said, yes, Pastor, go ahead, go down that trail. See, to my knowledge, there's nothing in the Bible or in the inspired writings of Ellen White that would indicate that the Sabbath ever existed before the creation of this world. Are you with me so far? I wonder if, before the creation of this world, the citizens of heaven and of the other created worlds in the universe hadn't lived in more of a state of perpetual Sabbath rather than celebrating one specific day. Now, I'm not asking you to say, yes, I think that's right. Just ponder it for a moment as I go on. Whether that is true or not, one thing is certain. The creation of this world and its subsequent fall to the power of sin changed everything. And that brings me to an interesting question. Was the Sabbath specifically created to be, listen, was it created to be an integral part of the post-fall redemption plan? And just think about that. And while you think and ponder that for a moment, let me continue just to be a bit further on this speculative detour. Most of us, I'm pretty sure, are convinced that there are other created worlds. Don't you think that there are? Yeah. I mean, it just makes sense. I mean, a very creative, talented human doesn't paint one and only one beautiful picture and then put away forever the brushes and the palette. So why would God, who is the essence of artistry and creativity, limit himself to one creative expression? In a similar vein, why would we imagine that the creation of all the other worlds would follow the same pattern as ours? See, they don't have to. In fact, I think that they didn't in many ways that we will learn, but many ways that we might speculate on right now. We know that we were made in the image of God. Isn't that right? Were the inhabitants of other worlds made according to that same pattern? Perhaps not. I certainly do not want to place any limits on the limitless creativity of our God. Now, where I'm going with this and how it relates to the Sabbath, let me explain. The Father and his brought forth Son, being of course all-knowing, would have created this world knowing that it would fall. Are you with me? I mean, I don't think anybody would deny that that's true. I believe that this fact may have greatly factored into the creation blueprint. For example, we know that the weekly cycle, look at the weekly cycle, it's not based on the movement of the sun or the planets. So in that regard, it seems kind of arbitrary, but instead it may have been specifically put in place for the creation of this world in this solar system because it was going to fall. Let me go on. You see, God, in his unfathomable wisdom, would have known that man, after the fall, would need 6/7 of his time to be delineated for work. Does that make sense? Don't forget, by the way, that one of the first things that God said to Adam after the fall was, "Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread." That's from Genesis 3:17 through 19. So it very much sounds like work was a vital prescription for the disease of sin. This prescription is found throughout the Bible, even in the Exodus 20 Sabbath commandment, which says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Psalms 128 verse 2 says, "When you eat the labor of your hands, you shall be happy, and it shall be well with you." Although the well-known saying, "idle hands are the devil's workshop," is not found verbatim in the Bible, it is certainly rooted in the Scriptures. God knew that fallen man would need to work and stay busy, and that this would form a protective shield against temptation and sin. God knew that we needed to work. Are you with me so far? But see, he also knew that we needed the Sabbath. Centuries later, when the children of Israel were enslaved in Egypt, they were getting plenty of work, but sadly, no Sabbath rest, until God freed them from their captivity. Is the Sabbath really that important? And if the Sabbath was specifically created for this soon-to-be fallen world, are there reasons that directly correspond with the sin problem? Well, the answer to that question is a resounding yes. So let's take a few moments to look at how the Sabbath was and is indeed an integral part of God's redemptive plan for this fallen world. I think we can all agree that after a week of work, the Sabbath is an amazing, just in the nick of time respite. And a more dramatic description is that the Sabbath is a weekly extraction mission, which thankfully rescues us out of the hustle and the bustle. It saves us from endless to-do lists. It relieves the pounding migraine of agendas, evaluations, appointments, and objectives, and delivers us from the maddening stress of rush hour traffic. The Sabbath refocuses our attention, as nothing else can, away from the brutal, energy-sapping onslaught of this world that we encounter throughout each week. It is one day that centers our thinking back on the eternal. The Sabbath is for our mental health. We need that rest. Several years ago, the National Geographic published an article entitled 5 Blue Zones Where the World's Healthiest People Live. I'm going to read you the introduction of that article. It says, for more than a decade, author Dan Buettner has been working to identify hotspots of longevity around the world. With the help of the National Geographic Society, Buettner set out to locate places that not only had high concentrations of individuals over 100 years old, but also clusters of people who had grown old without health problems like heart disease, obesity, cancer, or diabetes. Now, this article goes on to identify these blue zones. The first is Ikaria, Greece. The second is Okinawa, Japan. The third is the Ogliastra region of Sardinia. The fourth is Loma Linda, California. And the fifth is Nicoya Peninsula, Costa Rica. Now, obviously, I intend to focus on the fourth blue zone, Loma Linda, California, because it happens to be a community that has the highest concentration of Seventh-day Adventist Christians in the United States. The increased average longevity is attributed to a healthy diet and lifestyle. You see, many are vegetarians. They don't smoke, they don't drink, they exercise regularly, and, are you ready? And the Sabbath. And the Sabbath. Here's a quote from bluezones.com. Listen. A weekly break from the rigors of daily life, the 24-hour Sabbath provides a time to focus on family, God, camaraderie, and nature. Adventists claim this relieves their stress, that it strengthens social networks, and that it provides consistent exercise. The Sabbath is for our physical health. We need that rest. According to an article published in Science Daily, I'm skipping to another point here, okay? This was published in August of 2021. The majority of Americans now believe in the theory of evolution as opposed to the biblical story of creation. I want you to think about that for a second. Think about that, the implications. What that really means is that more than half of the population in a country which was specifically founded less than 250 years ago on biblical principles, have now embraced a science-based, totally atheistic version of where we all came from. God knew when He created this world that the demonically inspired theory of evolution would capture that world. And so for this reason also, He created the Sabbath. 24 hours each week set aside for reconnection with our Creator. I want you to listen again to this quote from the Desire of Ages. The Sabbath calls our thoughts to nature and brings us into communion with the Creator. In the song of the bird, the sighing of the trees, and the music of the sea, we still may hear His voice who talked with Adam and Eve in Eden in the cool of the day. And as we behold His power in nature, we find comfort, for the Word that created all things is that which speaks life to the soul. You see, the Sabbath is for our spiritual health, and we need that rest. A lot has happened since that very first Sabbath in the Garden of Eden. The Sabbath has been systematically mutilated, and it has been blatantly ignored. Sabbath keepers have been abused and marginalized, and the Lord of the Sabbath has been dishonored and forgotten. But the day is coming, friends, very soon. I both pray and I believe, when we will celebrate the Sabbath in a world without sin. Reading again from the Desire of Ages, she says, and when Eden shall bloom on earth again, God's holy rest day will be honored by all beneath the sun. From one Sabbath to another, the inhabitants of the glorified new earth shall go up to worship before me, saith the Lord. What will that Sabbath be like? But we will experience Sabbath the way it was originally intended to be experienced. Imagine with me just how different things will be as regards the Sabbath when evil no longer exists. Our minds will be totally free of sinful thoughts that compete with the purity and holiness of our God. No looming business decisions or social agendas that insidiously creep into the corners of our mind will intrude on those sacred hours. Our brains won't be cluttered with any of the world's myriad distractions. No sporting contests rehashed or anxiously anticipated. No television or movie scenes that transfix our senses. No gigantic, once-in-a-lifetime, never-before seen, all items must go sales, bonanzas to occupy our thinking. No agonizing real estate transactions to ponder. No iPhones, no social media, no YouTube. And as we worship on this first Sabbath, it won't be in a church that has been forced to contend with philosophical differences or theological divides. It won't be in a church that has been torn by apostasy or scarred by betrayal. We will not enter that worship service crippled by the wounds of our past or wrestling with the sins of our present. We won't look around us to see what so-and-so is wearing, or question whether this attire or that hairdo is appropriate for church on this Sabbath. We will no longer be the church's self-appointed music police or feel some strange obligation to meticulously critique the sermon content. We will be free from all of that. We will be finally and completely free to to full heart worship the one true God and His only begotten redeeming Son. We will be free to experience pure, unfiltered, uncluttered communion, a true one-on-one connection with our Lord, like Mary did when she sat at Jesus' feet in Bethany, in the very same way that Adam and Eve, pure and newly created, experienced Sabbath way, way, way back on that other first Sabbath.